Thank you for joining me on the Bold Lines podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the Addicted and Imprisoned. I'll give a heads up, this episode is going to encompass a good amount of information. It's also going to be a little bit spicy. This is the topic of my dissertation, so I'm going to try to keep the soapbox fairly low, but I can't make a ton of promises. Some of this information will be found in my first book, To Those Left Behind. You can find a link to that in the description. So let me give you some context on the addicted and imprisoned, those that are held for long sentences because of drug use. There are two types of incarceration, for those that are unaware. The two main types are jail and prison, and the crossover from jail into prison is when someone is held for over a year. So if someone's sentence is for 6 months, go to jail. If it's for over a year, they go to prison. Sometimes those terms seem to be used interchangeably, but they are rather specific. So just wanted to give that insight. The imprisonment around drug addiction and alcohol addiction really took off on the war on drugs. This came June 1971. It was backed by Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy Reagan, one of the champions of the Just Say No movement. It's actually the reason why there's a specific chapter in my first book called Thanks, Nancy. This was bolstered by the tough on crime movement of the 70s. This tough on crime movement was an effort to lower rates of risky behavior and impacts on the community by giving prison sentences, start punishing people. The war on drugs, what it did was it took that punishment of poor behavior, to maladaptive or antisocial behavior, and carried it over into drugs, where someone wouldn't just be cited for drugs. They wouldn't simply be punished if they were doing something illegal for drugs. The drugs themselves were made illegal. There's a whole argument around the legality of drugs. If you haven't gone down that rabbit hole, one of the interesting things is marijuana is given the same federal scheduling as heroin, so it's considered just as dangerous for some reason. And I'm a huge proponent of sobriety. I think that's the best way to go. But even for someone who is in total favor of sobriety, that just doesn't make any sense. And so you have this entire legal system that's set up to punish drug addiction, drug use, drug possession with an odd organizational structure to where a more easily accessible drug like marijuana is punished just the same as something like heroin. The last important landmark of this episode to know is mass incarceration. That's a term that's been thrown around a lot over many years, and it has a ton of different implications. Sometimes mass incarceration is spoken through a racial lens or a socioeconomic lens. I am just talking about from a numbers perspective, there's mass incarceration. Let me tell you what I mean by mass incarceration. From the 70s up until, I believe it was a few years ago, the United States had the highest number of individuals per capita incarcerated. Means jail and prison. Per 100,000 people, we outranked everyone, which is absolutely crazy. We certainly overran industrialized worlds, but even some of the corrupt governments of the world didn't house as many people as we did. Over the past few years, our numbers have gone down, but I think that's more due to COVID and people realizing that just throwing people in jail doesn't work than it is about any grand change in the criminal justice system. So we have the war on drugs, tough on crime initiatives, and mass incarceration. How does any of this affect those in addiction? Through my dissertation research, I've started to look at the long-term consequences of addiction, and especially the long-term consequences of the legalization or the intervention of the government through drug use and addiction. And in the majority of studies, the number one cause of recidivism is because of drug abuse. Now, that might sound interesting. In some studies, they point to antisocial behavior as being the number one cause of recidivism. Some people claim homelessness. If you look at it in context, though, if you were to take all of these studies and you were to pit them against one another, it's pretty obvious that if you were to take any random inmate and you were to spin the wheel to guess what would cause them to come back, it would be drug use, drug addiction. These points of recidivism include the use of drugs, public intoxication. It comes from possession if someone is arrested or pulled over and they have illegal drugs on them. There are also crimes because of use. This is one of the things that gets missed in data. I've come to understand this over the years, and especially the past year of my research, is people are arrested for small property crime. It's a really common one. But very few studies actually take into account why they're stealing. For some people, especially addicts, you can find motivation to steal things because it funds addiction. If you can get away with stealing little things, you can sell them at an insanely discounted rate to other people. They give you cash and voila, there's your drug money. The other ones that tend to cause recidivism around drug use are crimes in order to get drug money. So people involved in robberies, as well as if they're high and they make stupid decisions. A small subsection of this includes people who get arrested for assault, or they get arrested for battery or something else. And one of the things that we've noticed is there's a higher likelihood that someone was drinking heavily or using drugs. Whether you count that in drug addiction or not is up to you. But looking at all of these things, it seems rather apparent that drugs and alcohol have much more of an influence on our system than even a lot of research studies seem to be able to point out. Other ways that incarceration affects addicts is it cuts them off from employment and family. Now, I am absolutely a proponent of punishing people for negative social behavior. If you're affecting other people negatively in a way that violates their rights, you should go to jail. 100% on board with that. However, we also have to recognize that there are some people who, while they are using drugs or abusing alcohol, that their employment and their family dynamic might keep them stable. And once they are arrested, they lose it. Being arrested for drug abuse, drug possession, if it leads to a felony, that can create other employment issues. Let's say that someone is incarcerated, realizes that they have to change their lives. Then they come out and want to do something different, only to have a barrier of employment. I get it. People have to pay their dues, and I get that going to jail and having a felony on your record is a heads up to employers that this person may or may not be trusted, but there is a good question to ask here. If they did their time, why is there more time they have to pay? Again, some of this stuff is absolutely the fault of the addict. 100% on board with that. However, we have to consider what are the long-term impacts. Another really common issue with addicts when they're arrested is most of the time they're not given a medical detox. They're arrested, put in the back of a car, taken to a cell or put somewhere in holding, and there's nothing to help them come down. In some cases, it's annoying. In some cases, people will just get tired. In some cases, there can be vomiting and hallucinations. And in the case of things like benzodiazepines, stuff like Xanax, it can kill you. So there's significant risk to throwing people in jail when they're detoxing. Another big argument in this space right now, the correctional space, is that addicts aren't given support or direction. And there's certainly an argument around, well, is it punishment or is it restoration or is it a mix? Whatever you want to argue, most people will say when they're let out, when they leave their stay, you're kicked out the front door. And if you don't have anybody to pick you up, you just walk. And there's no way to really get help other than resources that you're told about or follow-ups that you have to have with a parole officer or any other support system. So people can be addicted, they get arrested, they detox in jail, they're given no sort of direction or support, then they leave. They're left isolated. And what do you think people do when they're highly isolated and they have a history of being addicted to drugs? They go back. The overall discussion around what to do with this dynamic has exponentially exploded. I'm going to try to keep this somewhat directional because, again, this is my wheelhouse. This is what I like to write and read about. But we have to figure out what can be done. How can we lower recidivism for a group of people that's addicted to a drug, a substance, or even a lifestyle? Quite honestly, this isn't necessarily the nicest thing to say, but sometimes there's nothing you can do. In my years of working with addicts, both inpatient and outpatient, sometimes there's nothing you can do to change their mind. People can become so accustomed to being addicted, homeless, and isolated that it becomes a comfort, and they don't want your help. It's a tough pill to swallow for all the wide-eyed and bushy-tailed therapists and interventionists out there. Sometimes people want to do this terrible thing until they die. Other things that can be done include harm reduction. In front of me, I have my list of talking points, and harm reduction is in heavy quotes here. Look, I get how harm reduction can seem to help. It considers people terminal if you give them harm reduction, because what was once, we'll give them a little bit of drugs to help them wean down, and then we'll cut them off, went from, well, this protocol will take 3 months. Okay, well, we'll get them weaned off in 6 months, and then a year, and then indefinitely. And then we said, well, wait a minute, they're not going to stop using drugs. So let's make it easier. Let's give them needles. We'll give them injection sites. And in order to do that, you have to accept that the person in front of you has a terminal disease of which they will never heal. One of the biggest problems is that the government has become a suicidal mother who just cares for people for no reason other than to make them hurt less. And instead of there being some social or religious or family engagement or accountability, the government's become a suicidal, empathetic mother. So does harm reduction work? I don't know. Ask the children who are left behind because their parent is still using and is on the street or somewhere else. So one other thing that can be done, sometimes people are left alone or ignored by the police. That's a common thing. It might sound a little harsh at first. Well, shouldn't police officers care about people in addiction? Think this through with me. They know that drug abuse is illegal. They have a pretty good guess the person in front of them is using drugs. What happens if they make contact with this individual and see all of this stuff? Then they have to make a judgment call of whether that person actually gets arrested or not. If they seem stable, though, it sounds harsh coming from the outside, but it might be kinder to leave them alone in their addiction than to toss them in the same cycle that will spit them out in 24 hours. So in some ways, you can keep people from arrest. This has been the dominant cycle for, I'd say, probably the past 30 years or so, where we've tried to make people okay by softening their fall. It's become really complicated nowadays because you have things like fentanyl, which is a substance exponentially more dangerous than morphine or heroin. And letting someone fall isn't just letting them hit rock bottom. It can be killing them. And I get that. And most people don't seem to have the stomach to be able to sit in the middle of that and care enough to let people fall or potentially die to save others around them. So what does this cycle do? We've created this indefinite system where addicts continue to relapse over and over. They go to jail, they get out, and they find drugs again. What happens? In a lot of cases, it can lead to prison. Some of that has lowered over the years as minimum sentencing has started to shift. But in times past, small crimes would build up. You had things like 3 strikes laws, and 3 strikes, you're out. You get caught for drug possession 3 times. Congrats, you've got a felony. Felony means prison. In other cases, you have people who just have a whole bunch of smaller crimes that they've been found guilty of, and it tends to show a pattern of behavior that makes people a little antagonistic or care a little bit less. You also get people in prison because they get more and more desperate for money and drugs. As more people cut them off, as family members care about them less for their own sake, people start doing wild things for community and money for drugs. One caveat to all of this, I will say, it is one thing to use drugs. Are you selfish for doing so? Yes. Is it a disease? No. If you are selling and distributing drugs, that's different. It is one thing to take the burden on yourself, heavy quotes here because you're affecting everyone around you. It's another thing to be an agent of destruction in those around you, where you potentially hand someone a death sentence so that you can have enough money to soothe your own self. To me, is an entirely different consideration. So what do we do? How in the world do we help people who, in a lot of cases, don't want help, long-term anyways, within a system where they're just coddled to their death? Everybody else has to deal with it. And quite frankly, it's done through taxes, so everybody pays for it. What do we do? Quite honestly, I don't know. I mean, I have some ideas. But if anyone were to look at the system and be honest with themselves, I don't think anyone could come away feeling optimistic. You see places like California, which heavily lean into this harm reduction model where they want to decriminalize everything and then start paying attention to their streets, and homeless and addicted populations just grow exponentially. They show up, they move there. And so what's the cost and benefit analysis here? Is it worth the payoff? I know that sounds odd or mean or dehumanizing, but we live in a society where we all affect one another. I don't exactly know what we need to do. I'd say personally, I don't know what else I can do. The time of recording this episode, I've spent 5 years studying, working on my PhD, conducting research, and trying to build relationships within my local correctional facility, and it's come up with nothing. Why did it come up with nothing? You might ask, well, did you work hard enough? Sure. Did you talk to enough people? Anyone who would listen? Did you try to volunteer and engage? Every opportunity I could. That direction, that hope for change, sometimes it's on a stall and sometimes it's dead, because the bottom line is, it doesn't matter how much you want to help. It depends on who's in charge. And if the person in charge doesn't want there to be intervention, doesn't think that addicts should get treatment for their own sakes, or I would say something rather beneficial to everyone I'll talk about here in a second, nothing's going to happen. You have to understand, if you want the correctional system to be different, you have to advocate for change that won't play out until another 10, 20, or 30 years from now. It's in no way going to change soon. And anybody who sells you that is selling you a bill of goods. And hoping that you didn't realize your wallet was gone. I tell you, appeals to kindness don't go anywhere here. If you see this issue and you have an ounce of empathy for the addict or for their family in this whole scenario, appealing to the heart of those in charge or those around you honestly won't help. Sounds awful, but hearts don't change policy. You can ask for kindness. You can hope that things could get better, but quite frankly, it won't work. And so here's what I'll tell you, and I put this in my book, that if you want change to happen, unfortunately, you have to appeal to money. You know what would cost less on the taxpayer? If there were interventions and treatments within the correctional system, particularly jails, that were focused on lowering drug use and recidivism. It would take more money up front, but in the long run, it should decrease the amount that it costs the government. And if you want a working program or a working theory that could help people and lay off the burden of everyone else, you have to talk money. You have to talk power and schmoozing, which in a helping profession doesn't sound nice. It doesn't sound clean, but it's the truth here. If you're someone listening to this and saying, oh my goodness, this is so much, how can I help? I'll ask you to push for good reform in sheriffs and county mayors whenever those elections come up. I need you to know that jails and prisons are run by counties typically. And people in charge of those are typically elected, or they're held up in some capacity. I'm not advocating that someone vote for a candidate that wants to blow a whole bunch of money to be nice. I'm talking about voting for people who really want to see change. And again, they might say it's because of care and compassion, but it's about money. And that's the field we're playing on. So if you don't know what to do or you don't know how to help, pay attention. Vote for sheriffs and county mayors that are actually wanting to make a difference. I would say ultimately, we still need to work on keeping personal responsibility. I can care for the heart, the mind, the soul, and the family of an addict, but I'm not going to do it as a suicidal, empathetic mother that the government has become. For my own sanity, but also for their potential for growth, because if I infantilize an addict, I hinder their ability to grow. So for the addicted and imprisoned, we have to make a choice. Where are we going to hold our intervention? Is it going to be when they're first arrested? It could be helpful. Is it when they've been continually arrested? Sure, that'd be a great time for intervention and planning. My best guess, do it at home. Do it in your local community with the children, the teens, and the young adults in your area. They're the ones that are still able to make significant change. Care for those that are struggling in your community. And I hope that in that 10, 20, and 30 years from now, there will be less of them. And maybe they can help other people as well. Some people listening might feel that this is a depressing episode, and quite frankly, it is. This is a depressing area of society right now. It's not going away soon. This episode was more to give you an idea of where all of this is headed, where it's come from, and the dynamics so that you feel informed. I hope that there are people who want to see change, that want to actually be the change instead of just the ones to complain about it. For anyone listening, at least now you know. You can't go back on what you know. And I hope that if you do participate in things like local elections or for advocacy, I hope that you do it in a reasonable and informed way. Care about people, but to larger authorities, appeal to cost and money. Because hopefully we can get both at the same time. Thank you for listening today. It's a bit of a somber episode, so if you made it all the way through, I'm definitely thankful that you did. If you feel that this episode was useful or beneficial, I hope that you follow the podcast for weekly releases. You can also share this episode with someone who might find this information useful. If you feel so inclined, I hope that put something in the tip jar to help pay for the production of this podcast. Thank you. Have a great day.